Santa isn't real, cried the orphans. Human soldier proved them wrong before. We dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. On a forgotten planet at the edge of the Terran Coalition, where the sky burned orange with distant warfare and the ground trembled from orbital bombardments, stood an orphanage that had seen better days. Inside, 63 children of 12 different species huddled together, their eyes reflecting the same emptiness that came from knowing they had nothing and no one. And among them stood Sergeant Blake Turner, a human soldier who had just made a promise he had no idea how to keep. 3 weeks earlier, Blake had been reassigned to Firebase Meridian on the planet Crows, a backwater world that had become strategically important overnight when the Vir Empire decided to push through the sector. His orders were simple: defend the Firebase, protect the supply lines, and keep the civilian population safe. What his orders hadn't mentioned was the orphanage. The journey to Kairos had taken 6 days aboard a military transport, 6 days of cramped quarters and recycled air, while Blake reviewed briefing materials about his new posting. The planet was technically classified as habitable, but just barely. The atmosphere was breathable. For most Coalition species, the gravity was 9 standard and the temperature range was survivable with minimal environmental suits. But Kairos was not a pleasant world. It was a world of red dust and harsh winds, of sparse vegetation and limited water. Before the war, it had been home to a small mining colony extracting rare minerals from the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the planet's crust. When the Vir Empire began its expansion into Coalition space, cows suddenly became strategically vital. The planet sat at a junction of 3 major hyperspace routes, making it a perfect staging ground for military operations. The Coalition had established Firebase Meridian 8 months ago, and the small mining colony had swelled with refugees from nearby systems that had already fallen to Vir forces. Blake arrived on a cold morning when the wind was howling across the landing field, carrying clouds of red dust that reduced visibility to almost nothing. He'd grabbed his gear, reported to the command center, and been assigned quarters in the prefabricated barracks that housed the Firebase's 300 personnel. The base commander, Captain Nathan Cross, had given him a brief orientation, outlining his duties as squad leader for 2nd Platoon, Defensive Perimeter Section. It was standard military posting, the kind Blake had done a dozen times before on a dozen different worlds: guard duty, patrol rotations, equipment maintenance, training exercises. The days blended together in a routine that was simultaneously boring and exhausting. But Blake didn't mind. After the chaos of the Battle of Proxima Station, where he lost half his squad in a boarding action against Vir raiders, boring was exactly what he needed. The orphanage sat 2 km from the Firebase, a squat building of recycled metal and desperate hope that housed the children left behind by the war. The structure had originally been a warehouse for the mining colony, but when the refugees started arriving and parents started dying, someone had converted it into emergency housing for orphan children. The building was ugly, functional, and completely inadequate for its current purpose. The walls were thin corrugated metal that did little to block the wind or retain heat. The windows were small and high, giving the interior a dim, cave-like quality. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the water recycler made ominous grinding sounds that suggested it was on its last legs. Inside that building lived 63 children, representing 12 different species from across coalition space. Some had lost parents to the fighting, watching from hiding places as Veer soldiers killed their families. Others had been orphaned by disease, the medical infrastructure of their home worlds collapsing under the strain of war and displacement. Still more had been abandoned when their families fled the advancing Veer forces, left behind because their parents couldn't afford to feed them or because they'd been separated in the chaos of evacuation and never reunited. The director was a Talvexian woman named Mira, whose 6 arms seemed constantly in motion as she tried to care for too many children with too few resources. Talvexians were naturally suited to multitasking, their complex neural structure allowing them to coordinate multiple actions simultaneously, but even Mira was overwhelmed. She had one assistant, a young human woman named Sarah, who'd been a teacher before the war, and between them they tried to provide food, shelter, education, medical care, and emotional support to children who'd experienced more trauma than most adults. Blake first visited the orphanage 3 weeks after arriving on Kos. He'd been assigned to drive a transport loaded with medical supplies to the civilian settlement on the far side of the firebase perimeter. The route took him past the orphanage, and as he drove, he saw children playing in the dirt outside the building. There were perhaps 20 of them, a mixed group of humans, Talvexians, Korans, and other species he didn't immediately recognize. They'd been engaged in some kind of game, using sticks and rocks to draw lines in the red dust, but they stopped when they saw his vehicle approaching. The change in their behavior struck Blake immediately. They didn't wave or run to the fence to watch the vehicle pass. They didn't show curiosity or excitement. Instead, they froze, their faces showing the universal expression of children who had learned through hard experience not to expect good things from adults they didn't know. Some of the smaller ones actually moved behind the older children, seeking protection from this potential threat. Something in their eyes, that mixture of weariness and resignation, reminded Blake powerfully of his own childhood in the Detroit refugee zones after the resource wars. He'd been 7 when the wars started, 10 when they ended, and those 3 years had taught him what it meant to be hungry, cold, and afraid. He'd learned to recognize the sound of distant explosions, to hide when armed strangers appeared, to be grateful for any scrap of food or kindness. He'd learned that the world was a dangerous place and that adults couldn't always protect you. Looking at these children, Blake saw his younger self reflected back at him. Without making a conscious decision, he pulled over. Mira met him at the door, her expression wary and tired. The Talvexians were naturally cautious, their evolutionary history on a world of predators having instilled a deep-seated suspicion of unexpected visitors. 2 of her arms were crossed defensively across her chest, while another pair rested protectively on the door frame, as if ready to slam the door shut if necessary. Her remaining 2 arms hung at her sides, the universal body language of someone prepared for trouble. Her compound eyes, capable of seeing in multiple spectrums, studied Blake with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking through him. rather than at him. "Sergeant," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected. We were not informed that Firebase Meridian would be conducting inspections today." Blake held up his hands in a placating gesture. "No inspection, ma'am. I was just driving by and saw the children outside. I stopped because I wanted to ask if you needed anything." Myra's expression didn't change, but Blake saw two of her arms relax slightly. She said, "We need many things, Sergeant: food, medicine, clean water, building materials, heating units that actually work, educational supplies, toys, clothing. The list is extensive and it grows longer every week. As more children arrive and our resources dwindle further, but I assume you are not authorized to provide military supplies to civilian facilities." Blake shifted his weight, suddenly feeling awkward. He hadn't actually thought this through. He'd stopped on impulse, driven by an emotional reaction to seeing those frightened children. Now he was standing at the door of an orphanage, having offered help he had no authority to give, but as he opened his mouth to apologize and leave, one of the children appeared behind Mira. She was a small human girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with tangled brown hair and eyes that were far too solemn for someone so young. She peered around Myra's leg, staring at Blake with the intense curiosity of a child who rarely saw new people. "Hello," Blake said, giving her a smile. "What's your name?" The girl didn't answer, just continued to stare. Mira placed one hand gently on the child's head. "This is Emma," Mira said. "She arrived last week. Her family was killed in a Veer raid on the Helios 3 colony. She hasn't spoken since she arrived." Blake felt something twist in his chest. He crouched down to Emma's level, making himself less intimidating. "Hi, Emma," he said softly. "I'm Blake. I'm a soldier at the base down the road. We're here to make sure you're safe." Emma's eyes searched his face, looking for something. Then slowly she raised one small hand and touched the sergeant stripes on Blake's sleeve. "You protect people?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Blake nodded. "That's right. That's my job. Can you protect us?" Question was so simple, so direct that Blake felt his throat tighten. He looked up at Mira, who was watching the exchange with an expression that might have been hope or might have been despair. He couldn't tell which. "Yes," Blake said, meeting Emma's eyes. "I can protect you. That's a promise." Even as he said it, Blake knew he was making a commitment that went far beyond his military duties. But looking at this child, at all the children in this inadequate building, he couldn't bring himself to care about regulations or proper channels. He stood and turned back to Mira. "I can't promise official support," he said, "but I can bring what I can find: extra rations, spare blankets, medical supplies that won't be missed. And I can fix things. I'm pretty good with mechanical systems. That water recycler sounds like it's about to die. I can take a look at it." For the first time, Myra's expression softened. She said, "Why would you do this, Sergeant? You don't know us. These children are not your responsibility." Blake looked past her into the orphanage, where he could see more children watching from the shadows. "Because someone should," he said simply, "and because I can." That question changed everything. What started as an impulsive stop became a regular part of Blake's routine. Over the next 2 weeks, Blake visited the orphanage every chance he got. He brought food that he'd saved from his own rations or traded favors to acquire from The mess hall, he brought blankets that were technically surplus, but that the base quartermaster had been willing to part with after Blake helped reorganize. The supply depot, he brought toys that soldiers had sent from home for distribution to civilian populations. He brought medical supplies that the base doctor had cleared for civilian use. Over the next 2 weeks, Blake became a regular visitor, and the orphanage became his second home. He brought food that he'd saved from his own rations or traded favors to acquire from the mess hall. Corporal Martinez in the kitchen was willing to part with extra bread and fruit in exchange for Blake taking his guard shifts on Friday nights. Private Johnson in supply had a stockpile of blankets that were technically surplus, and she was happy to donate them after Blake helped reorganize the supply depot on his day off. He brought toys that soldiers had sent from home for distribution to civilian population, small stuffed animals and simple games that brought rare smiles to tired faces. He brought medical supplies that the base doctor, an older man named Henderson who'd seen too many wars, had cleared for civilian use, understanding without being told why Blake was asking. But more than the supplies, Blake brought his time and his skills. He fixed the broken water recycler, spending an entire afternoon lying on his back in the cramped mechanical space beneath the building, replacing corroded pipes and recalibrating the filtration system. The recycler had been making a grinding sound that Mira said kept the children awake at night, a constant reminder that their one source of clean water might fail at any moment. When Blake finally got it running smoothly again, the children gathered around to watch clean water flow from the tap without any mechanical noise, treating it like a miracle. He patched holes in the roof, climbing up with sheets of surplus metal plating and a welding kit he'd borrowed from the motor pool. The roof leaked in 3 places, and every time it rained, the children had to move their sleeping mats to avoid the drips. Blake spent a full day up there welding patches and sealing seams while children watched from below and called up encouragement. When the next rain came and the roof stayed dry, they cheered like he'd won a major battle. He taught the older kids how to grow vegetables in the small greenhouse he'd helped them build from salvaged materials. The greenhouse was really just a frame of scrap metal, covered with transparent plastic sheeting, but it was enough to protect plants from Cauro's harsh winds and temperature swings. Blake showed them how to prepare soil, how to plant seeds, how to water and weed and watch for signs of growth. He taught them about photosynthesis and nutrient cycles, turning it into an impromptu science lesson that the children absorbed with surprising enthusiasm. When the first tomato plant produced actual tomatoes, small and green but real, the children treated them like precious jewels. Children started to warm to him, gradually, their initial weariness melting as they realized he was going to keep coming back. They'd run to the fence when they saw his transport coming, shouting his name in a dozen different languages. The human children called him Sergeant Blake. The Talvexian children, whose language had formal and informal modes, called him Blake, who helps the Corvan children, who had complex naming traditions based on actions and attributes, gave him a name that roughly translated to tall one who fixes things and brings food. Among them was a human girl named Lily, maybe 8 years old, with bright eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. She'd appointed herself Blake's shadow, following him around and asking endless questions about everything. Where did he come from? What was Earth like? Had he been in many battles? Why did he become a soldier? What was his favorite food? Did he have a family? The questions came in an unending stream, and Blake answered them all with patience that surprised him. Lily had arrived at the orphanage 6 months ago after her parents were killed in a shuttle accident during an evacuation from the Century colonies. She'd been the only survivor pulled from the wreckage with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and a small stuffed rabbit that she still carried everywhere. Mira had told Blake that Lily had nightmares most nights, waking up screaming about fire and falling, but during the day she maintained a brave face, always smiling, always asking questions, always trying to help the younger children. There were others, too, each with their own story, each carrying their own burdens. There was Marcus, a 10-year-old Corvan boy who had been separated from his parents during the evacuation of his home world and had somehow ended up on Cowrose instead of the refugee ship they'd been assigned to. He had a chronic respiratory condition that required expensive medication, and Mira was running out of the medicine he needed. Blake had started working with Dr. Henderson to see if they could find an alternative treatment using military medical supplies. There was a pair of Talvexian twins named Kira and Carrara, 5 years old, who'd watched their entire family die in a severe bombardment. They rarely spoke except to each other, communicating in a private language of gestures and sounds that even Mira couldn't fully understand. They spent most of their time huddled together in a corner, drawing pictures that were always the same: a house on fire and figures falling from the sky. There was Tomas, a human teenager who'd been living on the streets of 3 different planets before ending up at the orphanage. He had a hard shell of cynicism that he used to protect himself from disappointment, and he made a point of questioning everything Blake said and did. But Blake noticed that despite his skeptical attitude, Tomas was always nearby when Blake was working, watching and learning, occasionally offering unsolicited but surprisingly useful suggestions. There was Nara, a gentle authority girl whose species communicated partially through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. She'd lost her entire extended family network when the Veer had attacked her colony world, and she glowed with colors that Mira said indicated deep depression in authority psychology. But when Blake was around, her colors would shift toward the warmer spectrum, suggesting hope or contentment. And there was Emma, the little girl who'd asked Blake if he could protect them on his first visit. She'd started speaking more regularly after that conversation, though she remained quiet and watchful. She had a habit of appearing at Blake's elbow when he was working, silent as a ghost, just standing there and watching him with those solemn eyes. Blake had learned not to jump when she did that, and he'd started explaining what he was doing as he worked, turning repairs into teaching moments. It was Emma who first mentioned Christmas to him, though Blake didn't recognize the significance at the time. It was Lily who brought up Christmas, not Emma, as Blake had misremembered later. Blake was repairing a heating unit in the common room when Lily appeared at his elbow, as silent as Emma but more animated. He'd learned to sense when she was nearby, even when she didn't make a sound, some sixth sense that told him he was being watched. Blake, she said without preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone children use when they're about to ask an important question. Do you know about Christmas? Blake set down his tools and wiped grease from his hands. He looked at Lily, seeing the excitement barely contained in her expression. Yeah, I know about Christmas. Why do you ask? Her eyes lit up with an intensity he hadn't seen before, like someone had switched on a light inside her. Some of the other kids were talking about it yesterday. She said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Emma heard about it from one of the older human kids, and she told me, and then we asked some of the others, and some of them knew about it too. They said it's a human holiday where a magic man brings presents to children. They said he flies through space in a ship pulled by animals called reindeer, and he knows if you've been good or bad, and he brings toys to good children on Christmas Eve. They said he has a workshop at the North Pole where he makes all the toys with helpers called elves, and he has a list of every child in the galaxy, and he checks it twice to make sure he knows who deserves presents. Is that real? Is any of that true? Blake felt his heart sink. He knew what was coming, knew how this conversation would end, but he couldn't see any way to avoid it. The other children had filled Lily's head with all the details of the Santa Claus myth, the full elaborate mythology that human culture had built up over centuries, and now she was asking him, the only human adult she trusted, to confirm whether it was real. He could have said yes, could have let her keep believing for a while longer, but Blake had never been comfortable with lies, especially not to children who'd already been lied to by a universe that had promised them safety and family and happiness, and then taken it all away. It's called a legend, Lily, he said gently, a story that humans tell. It's not really real. Light died in her eyes so quickly it hurt to watch, like someone had flipped a switch and plunged her back into darkness. Her whole body seemed to deflate, shoulders slumping, head dropping. Oh, she said quietly, her voice small and defeated. I thought maybe since you're human, you might know him. I thought maybe he'd come here. Even though cows isn't on Earth, I thought maybe there was something good coming, something to look forward to. But it was just a story. Like everything else, good is just a story. Blake wanted to explain, wanted to tell her about the historical figure of St. Nicholas and the evolution of Christmas traditions through different cultures, and how it was really about family and giving and hope rather than a literal magical being who delivered presents. He wanted to talk about the spirit of Christmas and what the holiday meant to people, and how the story persisted because it represented something important about human nature and our desire to believe in generosity and magic. But looking at her face, at the hope that had bloomed and died in the space of seconds, at the way she was trying not to cry, he couldn't find any of those words. What could he say that would make this better? How could he explain that the absence of Santa Claus didn't mean the absence of all good things? I'm sorry, Lily, was all he managed. I wish it was real too. She nodded, still not looking at him, and walked away to join the other children. Blake watched her go, feeling like he'd failed some crucial test. He turned back to the heating unit, but his hands were shaking too much to work properly. That night, the Vecker attacked, and Blake's guilt over disappointing Lily was temporarily forgotten in the chaos of combat. It wasn't a major assault, just a probing raid to test the fire-based defenses, but It was enough to terrify the children at the orphanage. Blake spent the night, split between his post and checking on the orphanage, making sure none of the stray fire hit the building. When morning came and the vicar withdrew, he found the children gathered in the common room. They looked shell-shocked, even the ones who'd grown up with war. Mira approached him, her 6 arms wrapped around herself in a gesture of distress. She said, "They've been asking questions all morning about whether they're safe, about what happens if the Veer come back, about why their parents left them. I don't know what to tell them anymore, Sergeant. I don't know how to give them hope." Blake looked at the children, at their faces, representing a dozen worlds and species, all united in their fear and loss. His eyes found Lily in the crowd. She sat apart from the others, staring at nothing. Then an idea formed in his mind, an idea so ridiculous and impossible that he almost dismissed it immediately. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. He turned to Mira and said, "I need to know something. How many of these kids know about Christmas?" Mira's primary eyes blinked in confusion. "Human holiday, a few perhaps. Why?" "Because I'm going to make sure Santa Claus visits this orphanage." Mira stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Sergeant, I don't understand." Blake was already planning, already calculating what he'd need and how much time he had. "Christmas is in 3 weeks," he said. "These kids need something to believe in, something to hope for. They need magic, even if we have to create it ourselves." "You're going to pretend to be Santa Claus?" "Not exactly. I'm going to make them believe Santa Claus is real." There's a difference. Over the next week, Blake became a man possessed. He called in every favor he was owed, traded away personal items, and spent every minute of his off-duty time working on what he privately called Operation Actual Magic. First, he needed presence. That meant reaching out to other military units in the sector. He sent messages to ships, bases, and outposts, explaining the situation and asking for donations. The response surprised him. Within days, packages started arriving. Toys, books, games, clothing, candy. Soldiers from a dozen species contributed, sending whatever they could spare. A Corvin cruiser sent 3 crates of adaptive toys that could be configured for different species. Manipulators, a Terran destroyer, contributed educational tablets loaded with games and stories. An author medical ship sent plush animals that doubled as comfort items for traumatized children. The donations kept coming, but presents weren't enough. Blake needed to sell the whole experience. He enlisted the help of Corporal Jesse Chun, the base's chief engineer. Jesse was brilliant with fabrication and had a streak of mischief that Blake appreciated. When Blake explained what he needed, Jesse just grinned and said, "You want to build Santa's sleigh in space? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." "I'm absolutely in." They started with one of the base's old atmospheric shuttles, a boxy transport that was scheduled for decommissioning. Jesse worked magic with hull plating and paint, transforming it into something that didn't look like any military vehicle. He added decorative runners, curved prow, and external lights that could shift through different colors. For the reindeer, Blake initially thought they'd have to just paint suggestions on the hull, but Jesse had a better idea. The base had a squadron of reconnaissance drone, small flying units used for perimeter patrol. Jesse reprogrammed 8 of them, giving them a new flight pattern that would keep them in formation in front of the shuttle. Then he added custom shells to each drone, sculpting them to roughly resemble Earth reindeer, with the right lighting and the fact that most of the kids had never seen a reindeer. It just might work. The hardest part was the man himself. Blake wasn't going to wear the suit. He didn't have the build for it. And the kids knew his face too well. They needed someone the children had never met, someone who could sell the role completely. The answer came from an unexpected source. Captain Nathan Cross was the firebase commander, a career officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for being strictly by the book. He was also, as it turned out, a romantic. When Blake presented his plan during a staff meeting, half expecting to be shut down, Captain Cross listened silently. When Blake finished, the captain sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then Captain Cross said, "My daughter believed in Santa until she was 10. I never had the heart to tell her the truth. She figured it out on her own eventually, but those years when she believed, those were magic, real magic, the kind that makes childhood bearable. These kids have had their childhood stolen by this war. If we can give them back even one moment of that magic, then yes, Sergeant, you have my full support and my participation." Blake blinked. "Sir, you want to be Santa?" Captain Cross stood, and for the first time since Blake had met him, the man smiled. "I'm 62 years old, Sergeant. I've got the belly for it, I've got the beard, and I've got the voice. More importantly, I've got 3 weeks to learn everything there is to know about being Santa Claus, and you're going to teach me." The firebase became a secret workshop. Soldiers from every department contributed. The mess hall staff learned to make cookies in the shapes of Earth holiday symbols. The medical team filled small bags with candy and treats safe for all the species at the orphanage. The communications team recorded and edited audio tracks of bells and holiday music. Blake coached Captain Cross on the role, teaching him the mannerisms, the jolly laugh, the way Santa was supposed to interact with children. The captain threw himself into it with surprising enthusiasm, practicing his ho-hos and studying Earth Christmas traditions like they were military tactical manuals. Mira was brought into the secret. She was skeptical at first, worried that creating false hope might be worse than no hope at all. But as she watched the preparations, as she saw how many people were contributing to make this happen, her doubts began to fade. She agreed to help prepare the children, teaching them about Christmas without promising anything. She told them stories about the holiday, about the spirit of giving, about Santa Claus and his workshop at the North Pole. She didn't say he was coming, but she let them wonder. Blake visited the orphanage regularly, watching the children's growing excitement. They started making decorations from scrap materials, creating their own versions of Christmas trees and ornaments. They wrote letters to Santa asking not for expensive toys, but for simple things: a new blanket, a book, a toy to share with their friends. Lily gave her letter to Blake one afternoon. Her eyes serious, she said, "Can you make sure he gets this, if he's real, I mean?" Blake took the letter, carefully folding it and putting it in his pocket. "What did you ask for, Lily?" She looked down at her feet. "I asked him to help my friend Marcus. He's sick and the medicine isn't working. I asked if Santa could bring him something to make him better, and I asked for everyone here to have families again. I know. That's a lot, but the stories say Santa can do magic. Blake felt his throat tight. Her letter wasn't about toys or treats, it was about hope and healing. He made a mental note to talk to the medical team about Marcus. I'll make sure he gets it, he promised. 2 days before Christmas, a crisis nearly derailed everything. A Veer reconnaissance flight spotted the modified shuttle during a test run. The enemy ships didn't attack, but they'd seen enough to report something unusual. At the firebase, command sent an immediate message: all non-essential modifications to military equipment were to be removed, and all personnel were to be ready for a possible Veer assault. Blake stood in the hangar looking at the shuttle that Jesse had transformed, all their work, all their preparation about to be undone by military necessity. Then Captain Cross entered the hangar. He looked at the shuttle, then at Blake. The captain said, "How long would it take to remove the modifications?" Corporal Chin, Jesse, who'd been working on the final touches, looked up. 6 hours, sir, maybe 8. And how long to put them back? Jesse hesitated. 12 hours. Minimum. We'd never make Christmas Eve. Captain Cross nodded slowly. Then he turned to Blake. Sergeant Turner, your assessment, will the Vecker attack before Christmas? Blake considered the question seriously. Their intel suggested the Veer were regrouping after their recent defeats. An attack was possible but unlikely in the next 48 hours. Low probability, sir. They've pulled back to consolidate their forces. Then the modifications stay, the captain said firmly. If command asks, I authorized a morale operation for the civilian population. We're not canceling Christmas. Blake felt a surge of respect for the old officer. Yes, sir. Christmas Eve arrived. The orphanage was decorated, as well as 63 children and limited resources could manage. Garlands made from recycled materials hung from the ceiling. Handmade ornaments dangled from the walls, and in the center of the common room stood a tree fashioned from metal scraps and synthetic branches lit by small lights Jesse had rigged up. Children were excited but uncertain. Mira had told them that Santa might visit, but she'd also been careful not to promise anything. Some of the older kids were skeptical, insisting that Santa was just a story, but even they seemed to want to believe. Blake spent the afternoon at the orphanage, ostensibly doing maintenance, but really making final preparations. He checked the landing zone he'd cleared, tested the communication equipment he'd hidden, and confirmed that everything was ready. As evening fell, he gathered the children in the common room. He told them it's Christmas Eve, which means Santa makes his rounds. Now I can't promise he'll come here. He has a lot of places to visit, and I know some of you don't celebrate Christmas, but I think if we're lucky, and if we believe, he might stop by. One of the older children, a Corvin boy named Telk, crossed his arms and said, Santa isn't real, it's just a human story. Blake smiled. Maybe you're right, Telk, or maybe you're wrong. I guess we'll find out. As the sky grew dark, Blake excused himself, claiming he needed to return to the base. The children barely noticed him leave, too busy speculating about whether Santa would really come. Outside, Blake jogged to the hidden communication point and sent the signal. It's time. At the firebase, the operation launched with military precision. Captain Cross transformed by costume and makeup into a surprisingly convincing Santa Claus, climbed into the modified shuttle, His suit was perfect, red and white and trimmed with real fur, that one of the soldiers had somehow acquired, complete with black boots, polished to mirror shine, and a wide belt with an authentic-looking brass buckle, the white beard and wig, professionally crafted by the boss, theatrical makeup specialist borrowed from the entertainment division, made him look like he'd stepped straight out of an old Earth storybook. Even his eyes seemed to twinkle with genuine joy behind the round spectacles perched on his nose. Jesse and his team performed final checks on the reindeer drones, ensuring they'd fly in proper formation. With perfect synchronization, the shuttle's cargo hold was packed with wrapped presents in colorful paper, each one carefully labeled for a specific child based on the heartfelt letters they'd written and entrusted to Blake. The captain's voice came over the comm, deep and jolly even through the communication speaker, sounding exactly like Santa Claus should sound. All systems ready, Sergeant Turner. Let's bring some real magic to those children. Tonight the shuttle lifted off, the drones forming up in front of it in a perfect line from a distance with the colored lights Jesse had rigged. It actually looked like a sleigh being pulled by reindeer. At the orphanage, Blake stood with the children near the large viewing window. It was fully dark now, and the stars were coming out. Children pressed against the glass, searching the sky. Then Lily grabbed Blake's arm. She whispered, "What's that?" A light appeared in the distance, moving against the stars, then more lights, a formation of them, and the unmistakable shape of something approaching. The shuttle came in low and slow, the drones in perfect formation, pulling ahead of it. Jesse had programmed them to prance, their movements mimicking the gait of running animals. The colored lights shifted from red to green to gold, creating a mesmerizing display against the dark sky. The children erupted in shouts of amazement. Even the skeptical ones couldn't hide their wonder. The shuttle circled the orphanage once, bells playing from external speakers, then settled gently onto the landing pad Blake had prepared. The hatch opened and Santa Claus stepped out. Captain Cross had transformed completely. He moved with a jolly bounce in his step, his belly shaking as he laughed his practiced ho ho ho. A large sack was slung over his shoulder and his eyes twinkled behind round spectacles. Blake opened the orphanage door and Santa walked into a room full of stunned, silent children. Then he spoke, his voice booming and warm. Well, what do we have here? Have I found the orphanage on Kos? My navigation system said it should be right about here. The children couldn't speak. They just stared. Santa looked around the room, his eyes touching each child. "I must say you've done a wonderful job decorating. This tree is magnificent. Did you make these ornaments yourselves?" A small authority child raised a tentacle and said, "We made them from scraps." Santa beamed. "The best decorations are always made with love. Now I understand some of you wrote me letters." Slowly the children began to respond. Questions poured out. "How did you get here? Are those real reindeer? How did you know where we were? Do you really check if we've been good?" Santa answered each question with practiced ease, telling stories about his workshop, his reindeer that he'd specially trained to fly through space, and how he knew where every child in the galaxy was because of his special Christmas magic. Then he opened his sack and Blake helped him distribute the presents. Each child received a gift chosen specifically for them based on what they'd written in their letters. Corbin Child, who'd asked for art supplies, received a set of multispectrum drawing tools. Talvexian, who requested books, got a collection of stories from across the galaxy. A human boy who'd wanted a warm coat received one that would grow with him, courtesy of adaptive military fabric technology. Lily watched as each child opened their present, her own gift. Sitting unopened in her lap, she seemed almost afraid to look. Santa noticed and sat down beside her. He said, "Aren't you going to open yours?" She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "You're really real as belief can make me," Santa replied gently. "Now, open your present." With shaking hands, Lily unwrapped her gift. Inside was a stuffed animal, a earth bear, soft and warm, but there was something else, a smaller package underneath. She opened it and found a letter written in Captain Cross's careful handwriting, though she didn't know that. "Dear Lily," the letter read, "you asked me to help your friend Marcus and to give everyone here families again. The first I can do, I've arranged for Marcus to receive new medicine, something that should help him feel better. The second is harder, but I want you to know that family isn't always about the people you were born to. Sometimes family is the people who choose to care about you. Look around this room. Look at all these children who have become your brothers and sisters. Look at Mira, who works every day to keep you safe. Look at Sergeant Blake, who drives here every week to fix things and tell stories. That's family too. And I promise you, as long as there are people who believe in love and kindness, you'll never be without family." Lily clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. When she looked up, Santa was smiling at her. "Remember," he said softly, "Christmas isn't about the presents or the decorations. It's about hope and love, and believing that even in the darkest times there's still light. You keep believing, Lily. You keep hoping, and you take care of your family." Here she nodded, unable to speak. Santa stood and addressed all the children one last time. "I have many more stops to make tonight, children of crows, but I want you to remember that you are not forgotten. You are special, each and every one of you, and even though the galaxy is at war, even though times are hard, there are people fighting to make sure you're safe. They believe in you. I believe in you. Merry Christmas to all. And to all a good night." He walked to the door, turned and waved, then climbed back into his shuttle. The drones formed up, the engines hummed, and Santa's sleigh lifted into the night sky, disappearing among the stars. The children watched until they could no longer see the lights. Then they turned to each other, into their presents, chattering excitedly about what they'd seen and received. Blake watched them, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Mira approached him, all 6 arms crossed, but she was smiling. She said, "You humans are completely insane. You just diverted military resources, convinced your commanding officer to dress up like a mythical figure, and flew an unauthorized mission, all to make children believe in magic." Blake grinned. "Yes, ma'am, we did." Myra's smile widened. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The next morning, the Vecker attacked in force. It was the assault command had been worried about, a major push to take the fire base and the surrounding territory. Blake and every other soldier scrambled to their positions as enemy ships descended from orbit. The battle was fierce. The Veer came with 3 times the force intelligence had predicted, hitting the fire base with everything they had. Blake fought from his position in the defensive perimeter, coordinating fire teams and calling in artillery support. During a brief lull, his communication officer reported that the orphanage was in danger. A Veer strike team had broken through the perimeter and was heading straight for the building. Blake didn't hesitate. He grabbed 3 other soldiers and sprinted toward the orphanage, knowing they might not get there in time. They arrived to find Veer soldiers attempting to breach the orphanage doors. Blake and his team engaged immediately, turning the grounds into a firefight. Inside, Mira had gathered the children in the reinforced basement, but they could hear the sounds of combat above them. Lily clutched her stuffed bear, remembering Santa's words about hope. The battle for the orphanage lasted 20 minutes, but felt like hours. Blake's team was outnumbered, but they fought with the desperation of people protecting something precious. When reinforcements finally arrived, led by Captain Cross himself, still partially in his Santa costume under combat armor, they drove the Vecker back. The orphanage had taken damage, but the children were safe. When the all-clear sounded and Mira brought the children up from the basement, they found Blake and his team, battered and exhausted, standing guard at the door. Lily ran to Blake and threw her arms around him. She said, "You protected us. Just like Santa, family protects family." Blake hugged her back, his eyes stinging with something that wasn't smoke. "That's right, Lily, that's exactly right." The Veer assault was repelled, but it had been close. The firebase had held, but only barely. In the aftermath, as they counted casualties and assessed damage, Captain Cross called Blake to his office. Blake entered, expecting a reprimand for unauthorized action during the battle. Instead, he found the captain sitting at his desk, still wearing parts of his Santa costume under his uniform. The captain said, "Sergeant Turner, what you organized last night violated approximately 17 military regulations, diverted resources during wartime, and could technically be considered misuse of government property." "Yes, sir," Blake replied, standing at attention. It was also the finest example of maintaining civilian morale I've seen in 30 years of service. Command has been informed that our Christmas operation significantly boosted local civilian cooperation and improved intelligence gathering in the area. They've approved it as a legitimate psychological operation. Blake blinked in surprise. Captain Cross stood and extended his hand. "More importantly, Sergeant, what you did reminded me why we're fighting this war. It's not about territory or resources. It's about protecting the ability of children to believe in magic, to have hope, to know that someone cares about them. You gave those children something no Veer weapon could ever destroy." "Thank you." Blake shook his hand, overwhelmed. The captain smiled. "Also, I've received 17 requests from other units asking how we did it. Apparently word has spread, and now every firebase with nearby civilians wants to run their own Santa operation. Next year, you started something, Sergeant." Over the following weeks, as winter deepened on Kauros, the effects of Christmas Eve became apparent. The children at the orphanage were different. They smiled more, laughed more, played with more enthusiasm. The presents they'd received were treasured. But more than that, they'd been given something to believe in. Marcus, the sick boy Lily had asked Santa to help, responded well to the new medicine they Medical team provided. He still had hard days, but he was getting better. Lily kept her stuffed bear with her always. She named it Hope, and whenever things seemed dark, she'd hold it and remember Santa's words about family. Blake continued his visits to the orphanage, but now he came with help. Other soldiers from the base joined him, bringing supplies, skills, and their time. The orphanage became a project for the entire firebase, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Mira expanded the orphanage, taking in more children as the war created more refugees. With the firebase's help, she was able to care for them all. 3 months after Christmas, during a supply delivery, Telk, the Corvin boy who'd insisted Santa wasn't real, approached Blake. The boy said, "I've been thinking about Christmas Eve. I still don't understand how Santa could be real. The physics don't work, the logistics are impossible, and magic isn't scientifically valid." Blake nodded. "Seriously, those are good points, but I saw him." Tulls continued, "We all saw him, and he knew what we'd asked for in our letters, and he came all this way just for us, so either magic is real or something else happened." Blake waited. Tulsk looked up at him with large, intelligent eyes. "I think maybe Santa is real because people make him real. I think he exists because people believe he should exist, and they work to make it happen. That's a different kind of magic, but it's still magic. Is that right?" Blake smiled and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's exactly right, Telk. That's the best kind of magic there is." As the war continued, the story of the Christmas visit spread through the coalition forces. It became a legend, the tale of the firebase that brought Santa Claus to orphan children in a war zone. Other units tried to replicate it with varying degrees of success, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the trying, the effort to preserve hope and wonder in the darkness of war. Years later, after the war ended and the Veer Empire collapsed, Blake returned to Crows. The orphanage was still there, expanded and improved. Mira had retired but visited often, and many of the original children had grown up and returned to help run the place. Lily, now a young woman studying to be a teacher, met Blake at the door. She still had the stuffed bear, worn but carefully maintained. She said, "I never told you thank you, not properly. You gave me something to believe in when I had nothing. You showed me that family is real, that hope is real, that magic is real if you make it real." Blake shook his head. "That wasn't me, Lily. That was Santa." She smiled, the same smile she'd had as a child. "We both know who Santa really was, Sergeant, but you're right, it was Santa, because Santa is the part of us that believes we can make impossible things happen if we try hard enough, and you proved that night that humans don't just believe in impossible things, they make them real." Blake looked around the orphanage at the new children playing, at the pictures on the wall showing generations of kids who'd passed through these doors. In one frame, he saw a photo from that Christmas Eve showing Captain Cross in full Santa costume, surrounded by 63 amazed children. The captain had passed away the previous year, but his legacy lived on in every child who'd believed, in every soldier who'd helped, in every person who'd been inspired by the story. Maybe that was the real magic, Blake thought, not that one night when they'd convinced children that Santa was real, but all the nights afterward when those children grew up remembering that someone had cared enough to create magic for them. They carried that with them, And they passed it on. Lily linked her arm through Blake's. She said, "We're doing a Christmas celebration next month. We do one every year now for all the kids. Some of them have never heard of Christmas before they come here, but we teach them. We tell them about hope and family and believing in good things. Would you come? The kids would love to meet the famous Sergeant Turner." Blake smiled. "I'll be there, but I'm bringing reinforcements." That Christmas, 50 former soldiers from Firebase Meridian returned to Calrose. They brought presents, food, decorations, and stories. They spent the day with the children, playing games, sharing meals, and keeping alive the tradition that had started in the middle of a war. As evening fell and the children gathered to hear the story of that first Christmas Eve, Blake looked around the room and saw faces from a dozen worlds, all united in the simple joy of celebration. He saw adults who'd been those original 63 children, now telling the story to a new generation. He saw Mira, elderly but still vibrant, her 6 arms gesturing as she described the moment Santa's sleigh appeared in the sky, and he understood something fundamental about humanity, about why the other species in the galaxy found humans so bewildering and so inspiring. Humans didn't just believe in impossible things, they made them real through sheer determination and creativity and stubborn refusal to accept that some things couldn't be done. They looked at a galaxy full of war and darkness and said, "Not here, not for these children. Here there will be magic." That was the true meaning of humanity, not their strength or their technology or their tactical brilliance, but their absolute conviction that hope could be manufactured, that joy could be created, that magic could be real if you worked hard enough to make it so. The orphans had cried that Santa wasn't real, and they'd been right in the literal sense. But Blake and Captain Cross and Jesse and all the others had proved them wrong. In the way that mattered most, they proved that Santa was as real as the belief in him, as real as the love that motivated people to create wonder for children, as real as the hope that kept people fighting for a better tomorrow. And in proving that, they demonstrated something that would echo through the galaxy for generations. When humans decided something should be real, when they committed themselves to making the impossible happen, the universe itself seemed to bend to accommodate them. That was humanity's true gift to the galaxy. Not weapons or ships or clever tactics, but the unshakable belief that things could be better, should be better, and would be better if they worked to make it so. On a forgotten planet at the edge of what had once been a war zone, in an orphanage full of children who'd learned to hope again, the spirit of Christmas lived on, not as a religious holiday or a commercial event, but as a testament to what happened when humans decided to create magic. The children believed in Santa Claus because Santa Claus was real. He was real in the hearts of soldiers who gave their time and resources. He was real in the engineers who modified shuttles and programmed drones. He was real in the commanding officer who put on a red suit and said, "Ho, ho, ho," with genuine joy. He was real in every person who looked at suffering children and decided to do something about it. And as long as there were humans willing to create magic for those who needed it most, Santa Claus would always be real. The orphans had cried that Santa wasn't real, and a human soldier had proved them wrong, not with arguments or evidence, but with love and creativity and the kind of determined Madness that makes humans both terrifying and wonderful, because that's what humans do. They take impossible problems and find impossible solutions. They look at crying children and vow to give them something to smile about. They face darkness and create light, face despair and manufacture hope, face a universe that says magic isn't real and prove it wrong through the simple act of caring enough to try. That night, as the Christmas celebration wound down and the children prepared for bed, Lily stood at the window looking at the stars. Blake joined her and together they watched the sky. Somewhere up there, she said softly, do you think the real Santa exists? I mean, beyond what we make real? Blake considered the question. Then he said, I think magic exists wherever people create it, whether that's here on Crows or somewhere among the stars. The real question isn't whether Santa exists out there, but whether we keep making him real right here. Lily nodded, satisfied with that answer. She turned from the window and looked at the room full of children, former soldiers and caregivers, all united in celebration. Then we'll keep making him real every year for every child who needs to believe. That's our job now. That's humanity's job. Blake smiled. That's exactly right. And as the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small dramas of the beings below, one truth remained constant. On a forgotten planet called Cowrose, in an orphanage full of hope, Santa Claus was real because people made him real, and he would stay real as the human capacity for love and creativity and stubborn determination to bring light into darkness. The orphans had cried that Santa wasn't real. They'd been wrong, and in being proved wrong, they'd learned something far more valuable than the truth about a holiday figure. They'd learned that humans, when motivated by love and armed with determination, could make anything real. That was the lesson that would stay with them forever. That was the gift that kept on giving long after the presents were unwrapped and the decorations came down. The knowledge that magic was real because people made it real, and that as long as there were humans in the universe, there would always be someone willing to create magic for those who needed it most. And that was the greatest gift of all. And that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug and see you in the next